Good day, ladies and gentlemen. This is Watson Michael from Ceylon Institute of English and Leadership. And once again, we are honored to have Sean Kidney, CEO and co-founder of Climate Bonds Initiative, also professor in practice at SOAS University of London. Also, he's on various other boards around the world, some of which are connected to the UN as well. Sean, welcome back. How are you doing?
Hey, Watson. Thanks for having me on. All good here.
Great. So, Sean, these days with geopolitical uncertainties in today's world, climate funding remains a challenge. The US, for the second time, withdrew from the Paris Agreement. How is this influencing or affecting the road to decarbonization?
Well, we're only a few months into a Trump presidency. So, hey, guys, give it time. you know, we can. There's a hell of a lot of panic in the world about measures being taken. But one thing we know about Trump is there's a hell of a lot of feinting and bluffing going on, and then he settles down to something not quite so extreme. That's his modus operandi. If you look at what's happening with the S&P at the moment in the US, it's settled down. It's no longer spiking all over the place because people are now factoring in craziness and just saying, actually, it's not going to make that big a difference. We'll see going forward. With the Paris Agreement, well, they have withdrawn from the Paris Agreement once before, for 4 years. Didn't actually make much difference to the trajectory of change, nor did it make much difference to fossil fuels. Trump talked up new coal-fired power stations last time he was president. None were built in the 4 years he was president. We don't really expect it to be much change. The energy revolution has happened. It's already creating massive change around the world. Texas is a 50% wind energy state. Guys, that's nothing to do with climate change. It's now just cheaper and better and so on. And that applies everywhere, really. So large chunks of what's going on in terms of the revolution we need to see and are seeing are not going to be changed, are unfazed about it. And the real motors of the global economy are not China. Sorry, not US, they're China. And nowadays India as well. So China year before last, invested 277 gigawatts of solar. So invested in building it. That's just a vast amount. That's
Wow.
nearly 50% of the solar installed globally. Wind is growing, nuclear is growing, everything's growing, and their emissions, as far as we can see, have now peaked and are starting to come down. Their electric vehicles, 50% of all cars sold in China last year were electric, and some of those are really, really cool cars. They leave Tesla in the dust, and they're winning on features now, and they're winning on price. And you saw that BYD rolled out a new electric vehicle that can do 500 miles and 5-minute charging. The technological change that's flowing through in the wake of large-scale sales and demand is extraordinary. And that's the reason the oil industry is toast, because the oil industry is driven by auto usage, and auto usage is, the electric vehicle fleet is just starting to boom. Fleet sales in particular are going electric because it's cheaper to run them, et cetera, et cetera. So this revolution is not going to change, no matter, you can huff and you can puff and you can try and blow the house down, but it doesn't mean you're going to succeed. So that's my first reaction. Of course, there are some pretty nasty short-term impacts. I worry less about climate than I do about things like feeding refugees. USAID, the cuts in USAID, I heard of one camp in Malawi where the US presidency announced cuts to USAID on a Friday, and no food turned up at the camp on Monday morning. Now, people couldn't eat. And then Tuesday morning as well. And then on Wednesday morning, a US donor found out about this and actually sent a check to the relevant companies in Malawi, said, please deliver food, and food started flowing again. Or the HIV/AIDS users across Africa that have been supported by the payment of drugs in a scheme set up by George Bush when he was president, that's been cut. They suddenly can't get their drugs. They're going to die, a lot of them. So they're the real impacts. These are at the very minimum very sad stories. Now, of course, it was rich country money being given to poor country. You say, why doesn't South Africa pay for this? Why doesn't Malawi pay for this? That's right. But they're really poor, and people would have died with the amount of money Malawi had to invest in this sort of stuff. And we were helping them in rich countries by transferring money. It's not only the US, other countries do a lot of this as well. So it is sad. And so, but is it going to change the direction of the global revolution that addresses climate change? Not really. Is the US withdrawing to unitary policy going to change things? Sure, it's going to make the formal negotiations around a climate agreement very difficult. Hey, what's new, everyone? It's been difficult for 30 years, and it's not as if we've had much progress. I mean, that's not true. We've made a lot of progress, but nowhere near enough, especially as we keep getting blindsided and undermined by some fossil fuel states and fossil fuel companies. And so all the agreements we agree on have no teeth. So emissions have been going up. I think they're now going to start going down because of state action by the likes of China and the European Union in the past that have driven huge changes, and the Biden administration, to its credit, when it was in power, with the Inflation Reduction Act and vast investment in renewables and other kinds of green investments, a lot of which is still flowing through. Oh, I mean, it's a bummer. Let's call it. It's a pain in the ass. It's especially a pain in the ass for those people negatively affected by the cuts to aid, who are negatively affected by the crazy business volatility that comes out of a government that can't decide if it's Arthur or Martha, and by US domestic issue citizens in the US who are being incredibly negatively affected by the hostile policies used. But it's not going to change things. We've managed to get the world shifting that far. And when I speak to investors all around the world, including in the US, there's no change for them. As far as they're concerned, yes, they are going to be a bit more careful about what they say in public because no one wants to get an administration official attacking them. Yes, in the US, they've taken down the diversity and inclusion policies on the website, gone, disappeared. Have they changed their portfolio investment strategies? No, none of them. Even Larry Fink said, the head of BlackRock, when he said, we're no longer an ESG house, in response to pressure from the White House and various other measures, he said, but there'll be no change to our investment methodologies. What we're talking about is how we're going to make money in the future, how we're going to reduce risk of losing money. That's exactly what we're talking about. And on those topics, the cat's out of the bag. It's going to happen.
Definitely. So now, how can we balance the needs of economic development with the urgency of climate action?
Climate action means many things. Climate action absolutely means reducing your emissions. But the biggest place we have to reduce emissions is China, which is the biggest emitter in the world. We do have to reduce also in India because emissions are growing very fast. We have to reduce in the US. Okay, that's going to be a bit of a pain, although I predict for you that emissions will still have reduced over the 4 years of the Trump administration, despite all the noise in the US. But we'll get that's a longer conversation about why. But that's certainly the trajectory of change. And we need to reduce it in other rich countries like Japan and Korea and European countries. Of course we do. In Sri Lanka, I think it's crazy to invest in emissions, but it's not as if it's happening at your scale. And look, I'm not going to try and convince a Sri Lankan to buy a electric car rather than a petrol car. A, it's not the critical issue for Sri Lanka. And B, it'll happen when those cars become cheaper and easier and the ranges. It's going to happen anyway. In Sri Lanka, I'm much more worried about resilience. I'm much more worried about the capacity of Sri Lanka to survive climate shocks, which are now going to become normal, which are now becoming normal. This year, we believe more people will die on this planet from heat than ever before in human history.
Wow.
We're going to have a very hot year. In London right now, it is an unusual, for London, 27 degrees. Well, that's nothing for Colombia. In Frankfurt, it's 35 degrees. That is crazy for Frankfurt at this time of the year. Or August, 2 days a year, maybe, and so on and so on. And we're seeing already heat spikes around the world. And it's relatively early in the northern summer, at least. So, that's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about increased storm intensity, which is coming, which is happening right now. The last hurricane season in the US and Caribbean, we had not so much more hurricanes, but much more severe, a lot of severe ones. Like, intensity is getting crazy. And this is just the beginning. Like, we've got 30 years of worsening climate now certain. So if you're someone interested in climate, don't try and think that if we cut emissions in China tomorrow, we'll be able to stop climate change. It's too late. If we cut emissions tomorrow, we're stopping climate change after 2050. We're stopping it getting so bad that humans can't exist. In the meantime, the next 30 years of climate change is baked in. That's already because of the emissions we put in the last 30 years. It's just taking time to wash through the global system. So you can be certain sea level rises, sure. But what's worse is storm surges and king tides. So we're going to get floods, periodic floods along those lines. Mumbai will go underwater more frequently in the future and more loss of life as a result. You can be certain that storms will become much more intense, but you can also be certain that sometimes they'll just disappear. The prediction is that the monsoon will fail maybe every 5 years. Now, think about that for northern India, which only survives because of the monsoon. It just doesn't come one year. What do you do? How do you survive that kind of stuff? Well, you're going to have water infrastructure in place, right? I mean, across India, there are wells that have been built in the last 4,000 years at various times to survive crisis, but we have a lot more people now. So that's a resilience issue. How do we deal with the economic disruption? If Sri Lanka gets hit by crazy weather incidents one year, it'll throw out the whole economy. And will we have enough food the next day to be able to feed people? Will we have enough reserves in the economy to be able to make sure we can get the economy working again the next month and so on? Or is it going to be a long train wreck of disaster that'll take years to fix, etc.? All of these things are things we have to worry about, because one thing is absolutely certain. Climate change, severity is now coming through, and we're just at the beginning of the J curve. So plan. And now how that relates to development is, well, first, all development needs to bear that in mind. Think of it as a pure procurement requirement. If you're building water infrastructure in Kandy and you're trying to make sure that it's future fit, you've got to take into account that rainfall is going to go like this now. And one thing that we're seeing already just within a year is that rainfall comes in dumps and then you get droughts all around the world. Now, volatility is the word to understand. Everything's getting more volatile. So the water infrastructure has to be future fit, and it can't rely on history to determine what is future fit. So that's a change. But development is also important because Sri Lanka has to be wealthy enough to be able to do it. Because, if there's a really big crisis and Sri Lanka gets hit, and then Bengal gets hit at the same time, and then Ethiopia gets hit at the same time, and then Mississippi gets hit at the same time, there aren't going to be many overseas donors queuing at the door of Sri Lanka to hand over money. It's going to be one of the horrible realities of a world of constant extreme incidents, which means Sri Lanka has to be wealthy enough to be able to recover itself. Now, there's a lot of ways of expressing that wealth. The most important way is the people. So we need expertise in Sri Lanka to be able to rebuild the economy if we need to rebuild it, and rebuild society, rebuild infrastructure. We need enough financial reserves to be able to deal with total emergencies. We need the infrastructure by way of emergency services and health to be able to deal with fresh pandemics and so on. That's all comes from development, but it needs to be development done in a way to meet these really severe crises we're going to experience everywhere around the world in the future. We need Sri Lanka to be wealthier in a way that is resilient. Now, this isn't just a human development index. This isn't just because we want to stop young people babies dying and improve infant mortality rates and so on. It's because if Sri Lanka implodes, it'll suck in other countries around it. It'll create a regional disaster. You'll get a million people trying to get across to Madras, to Chennai and so on, and that will create its own disasters. We will see economic implosion in the region. We can't afford all those things. The world can't afford it. So I'm saying everywhere, change your ODA, overseas development assistance, to make sure that you're addressing resilience as part of that, but also turbocharge your thing to make places like Sri Lanka wealthier, which means investing in the right kinds of infrastructure that'll create wealth. So it means basic infrastructure, water and transport, especially, and water, transport and energy, and it means investing in education and health. Quick, I say. Now, we're not going to get bigger transfers from the north. The USA's gone missing in action somewhere. Other countries are stepping up to a certain degree, but not enough. So we have to do it for other ways, which is an investment approach. We're going to have to create attractive investments in these areas in Sri Lanka to get the money in from places like Europe and China and India to give them a return. And how do we do that? Well, that's the art of what we've been talking about in our last few podcasts, Watson, and what we've got to do going forward. That's really it. It's not going to come from transfers as much as I would like it to be something different.
Sure. Yeah, very insightful, Sean, right? So now the emissions which are trapped in the atmosphere take decades to react. Already, like you mentioned, chaotic weather patterns are there. Damage is being done. And if we don't take steps to prevent human-induced climate change weather patterns, things will be catastrophic. Coastal areas need safe environments. Air pollution is there. So what are your views on this?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand that, Watson. My views on... repeat the question.
Sure. So now the emissions which are trapped in the atmosphere take decades to react. And already, like you mentioned, chaotic weather patterns are there around the world. And damage is being done. So like you mentioned, if we don't take steps to prevent these climate change weather patterns, it's going to be catastrophic. So coastal areas need safe environments. Air pollution is already there in spots. So what are your views on this?
Well, my first view is it's going to be catastrophic, full stop. But our definition of catastrophe can be varied. The sort of things we see as catastrophes now are going to become a norm. So when climate change happens, there are three things we know that happen from history. When it happens, it's famine, pandemic, and war. It's not gently rising sea levels or floods. They're just the easy part, I have to say, horribly, because people die in those things. It's the consequences of those that are the real issue. So that's going to happen. The question is whether we can make the impact relatively modest by preparing and by having the right shock absorbers. In economies, in economics, in the Europe and the US, the 19th century was essentially a long series of crashes. Boom, crash, boom, crash, boom, crash. There was no mechanism to ameliorate the risk. People just lost their jobs. Vast unemployment in the 1880s, those sorts of things. So people got crazily enthused about something, invested because there was their surplus wealth. Invested it, then lost all their money, and some freebooter took it somewhere, et cetera, et cetera. We learned from economic management to bring in institutions and policies to reduce the crisis, the extent of the crisis. Because when we had a really big crisis, like in the Great Depression in the 1930s, it lasted a long time, and we learned that we could actually make it a very short-term crisis. We created unemployment relief in rich countries, for example. In the pandemic recently, we created helicopter money in some countries, which is the central banks printed money and distributed it when people were stuck at home so people will be able to get food to eat. These were incredible innovations to create resilience in an economy and a society. We're going to get more of these crises. We need to be really conscious of preparation and creating the institutions and mechanism, the safety net to bounce us back up. So that's the work that we need to do to be able to manage what is baked in the system. There are going to be catastrophes, and where we don't have those kinds of support mechanisms, there's going to be really ugly catastrophes. You know, at the moment, Ethiopia is in war in many places. Addis has good systems, but do we have the support mechanisms in place? If we had a major crisis in Ethiopia now, we would have a massive famine, as we had in northern Ethiopia during the midst of a civil war a few years ago. Ethiopia can't survive major crises at the moment because it's not prepared and hasn't been able to do it because of internal conflict, etc., etc., etc. Sri Lanka's got to be, where you are, has got to be really careful of now planning for crisis going forward. The difference between old sense of catastrophe and new sense of catastrophe with the extent to which we can plan and prepare the right kind of way. So that's my first point. My second point is there are extreme catastrophes that we're still fighting to stop. They're post 2050. And that's why we still have to work very hard on emissions reductions. We have to drastically reduce emissions, and we're not at the moment. Now, I'm not going to start waving a finger because it's a waste of time. I'm looking at how we shift things to the benefit of all. No single country will have an aggressive enough policy to change emissions on the basis of climate change. Not going to happen, even less so if the US out of the picture. China didn't decide to invest vast amounts of money in solar energy and renewable energy on the basis of climate change. It invested initially on the basis of air pollution, which was a political legitimacy risk for the Communist Party because it was so severe. And I can remember being in Beijing in 2014 and not being told I couldn't go outside during the daytime. And because of energy security, because they import oil through the Straits of Malacca from the Middle East. The US 7th Fleet can blockade them anytime they like. And that would freeze up China. Well, what's a good solution? Alternative energy sources domestically. The reason they don't want to shut down coal now is that actually they'd rather shut down gas and oil before they shut down coal because coal is mined locally. Sensible from a security perspective. And the more renewable energy they build locally, the less they need to import energy. So that's been one of the underpinnings of that market. And the more electric vehicles that use electricity are used, the less oil they have to import. You can sort of see why it's energy security that's been the driving force of the change. And that's great. Now, just so happens that it helps the world climate. It's been helping the world climate incredibly going forward. Every country is the same. In Japan, the change to renewable energy that we expect to see happening is going to come for the same reason, because they import a lot of energy through the South China Sea, which is now a geopolitical hotspot. So, you know, when we talk about the motivations for individual governments to do stuff, especially emissions, we can't afford to just talk about climate activity because there's a tragedy of the commons involved. There has to be a domestic reason to make it work going forward, whether security or energy or competitive advantage or whatever. And of course, that's the nature because our policymakers, our decision makers are trapped with a whole lot of short-term and long-term issues they're trying to address. The more they can tick a hole with one policy, the more likely it is to happen. So I think we're going to make progress as a result of those kinds of discussions in different parts of the world. But I just want to stress catastrophe of the sort we understand in the past is now baked in. We're looking for measures to stop extreme catastrophe after 2050. Most of that work does not involve development aid. It does not involve transfers of cash. It involves creating investable propositions. It's about energy policy. It's about regulatory support. It is about guarantees. We can get more guarantees now from the Asian Development Bank for bond issuance out of Sri Lanka, just as an example, than we could in the past. It was green. So there's those sort of measures as well. But the policy steps to be able to do the right kind of planning and then get funding for is the most important thing we have to address right now. And there, you know, we have a capability, a lack of scientists, a lack of people, often a lack of good journalists who are talking up the issue in a way politicians can understand. Watson, that's you.
Me. All right. Okay. I'm not a politician. Okay.
No. But you have to explain and lead. You have to. Your job is to take a complex issues and make sure people understand it, so that they can therefore have enough
Absolutely.
understanding to act in the right way. This is a critical task at the moment.
100%. 100%. And with people like you, it makes my job easier, Sean. Right? Thank you for that. Great. So now, can you tell us about the climate bonds resilience program and how is the green market bond these days?
So the green bond market is doing very well. The green, social, and sustainable bond market is just about to hit $6 trillion US outstanding. So it continues to grow, and it's continued to grow since Trump came into power. just as a footnote, the sovereign bonds are growing. China issued its first green sovereign bond recently, for example, and we'll see about $700 million. We'll see a lot more coming from them going forward, which is scale in the program. We are expanding our definitions. That is our eligibility criteria, what qualifies in many ways. We've been talking a lot about the need to support transition investments in the last few years. Think of it as a steel company moving to produce green steel using renewable energy and hydrogen rather than coal, for example. There's a lot of these investments now underway. And also recently, and you can, given my comments earlier in this podcast, you'll know why, we've been focusing on guidance around resilience investments. So we've published a climate bonds resilience taxonomy, which is a first stage, which maps out 1,440 areas that are important to look at in terms of resilience. Everything from infrastructure resilience to the right kind of health investments and social investments and nature. And we're now doing further work on detailed guidance. But in the meantime, we're starting to support issuance. So the Tokyo City, for example, is about to do a resilience bond using our guidance and so on. And many other countries and subnationals look at doing that at the moment. There will be some corporate as well. There are already resilience bonds out there. About 7% of the global green bond market is for resilience. And another 7% has some resilience in it, mixed portfolios sort of idea. So we're not starting scratch, but we need to grow this. Our view is that more than 50% of what will be a $20 trillion market in 2030 needs to be going to resilience. And that's because in some places, like Sri Lanka, resilience is everything. There will be there'll be only minimal bonds or debt of any kind or investments related to mitigation. There will be some. There are some fantastic bioenergy projects happening in Sri Lanka at the moment, all of which, when they have to raise capital, can qualify. There will be a lots of other projects too, but there are going to be a lot of projects related to the resilience criteria. And so that's what we've been doing. And that's an ongoing piece of work, more detailed guidance coming through the system.
Wow. Fantastic. Great. So Sean, any final message to our viewers and listeners out there?
When we are looking at what needs to be done, and the nature of the human species, the nature of you and I as ordinary people, is that we look to the future. We are weirdly optimistic humans, which is a survival mechanism, right? We have to look and imagine what could be, and apart from we get caught up in depression and stuff, not get trapped by the problems. Look for ways forward. Well, there are a lot of ways forward, even in a changed world. If we get our resilience activities right, including more insurance programs as well, so financial instruments to solve that, we can survive this volatility. So, there will be upsides of various kinds, including an increased focus on developing local wealth to be able to survive, to be resilient to those sort of changes. There'll be new industries created to manage all these things. If we get ahead of those, we can be winners. On the mitigation side, getting rid of fossil fuels is not a negative. In the way we're doing it and have been doing it, renewable energy is going to be way, way cheaper than fossil fuels ever were. Over the next 30 years, we will see the beginning of a new global era of cheap energy. It's already started happening. In many places, it's much cheaper. If you go to Gujarat now and Rajasthan, the vast solar plants that are there are delivering cheap energy into Mumbai and into the Gujarat clusters. That's already happening. And Adani will talk about how they see the future of India based on cheap energy that Germany had in the past, and it's Adani's turn because of solar, etc., and India's turn because of solar. And I think they're right. I think the places that have very strong sunlight and very strong wind power will become sources of wealth creation, as the places of coal in the past have been. All sorts of industry will be around them, and it'll be cheap. And the key driver of technological and wealth creation in societies in the last 250 years, not in the past, last 250 years, has been energy and cheap energy. So I'm going to say to you, I'm very optimistic. Hey, it's a bit of a line ball thing, as you and I have discussed before. We're so close to disaster. But energy is becoming a lot cheaper. It will allow a lot more things to be created and new industries to build up and wealth to be created. It will allow us to generate a future despite the craziness that's coming through. So I'm very optimistic, really. The investment pipeline to do all of this is unbelievably large. $10 trillion a year, US, at least. That's got to be invested in all this stuff. But the good news is there's no shortage of capital. And I speak to global investors all the time. They have money pouring out of their ears. It's one of the great successes of economic development in the last 70 years that we have managed to create large pools of capital, pension funds, insurance funds, sovereign wealth funds, bank treasuries, central bank funds, etc. $130 trillion or so sitting in that lot. They need to invest. They have a shortage of places to invest, and they want to go green because they understand the risk. That's how we do it.
Absolutely. Sean, thank you very much for taking time and articulating the subject very well. It's an excellent masterclass as well. And yep, thank you, Sean. Thank you.
Thank you, Watson. Good luck at the work. Good luck with making sure the world understands what it needs to do.
Absolutely. Thank you.